without showing every single piece in this exhibition. So I made another dividing, and we're going to look at several different divisions of the work here today. The first piece is literally came in the week that the exhibition opened, is Alexa Kleinbard's piece, Humphrey, Madonna Lily, Arnica, and Solomon's Seal. This is a wood cutout piece. It doesn't have the dimensions on here, but it's about 4 feet tall, 3.5, maybe about 3 feet tall, actually. And this is from a series that she did called Remedies. I showed this work in 2012, a solo exhibition of this series, when the Ogden, Richard McCabe and I curated the Ogden in 2012, where every changing exhibition was themed around environmental concerns. And she had a solo at that time called Remedies. And Alexa and her husband collect these folk art paintings that they call faraways. So these little depictions of wetland scenes, you know, there's a lake vista maybe with some vegetation in the foreground, mountains in the background, very pastoral scenes that are, you know, vernacular artists painted in their living room, et cetera. And they've got a huge collection of these things, and they adore them. So she's using this idea of what she calls a faraway, where you're like kind of pushing through the vegetation and looking at this vista of the wetlands. And she's depicting the wetlands. That's St. Mark's in Florida. And she's also depicting the herbal plants, the medicinal plants from that would grow in that wetland. And then she's got the root system, and she also has the pollinators. So the pollinators that do the work to keep these plants reproducing. So it's a beautiful piece. I sent everything back, and then she decided that she wanted to give us one to be in the Ogden's collection. It was just in the nick of time, and the piece is now on the title wall of the exhibition. So the first kind of grouping that we'll look at is vernacular art. And the first piece here is Cherokee Lovebirds by B.F. Perkins. And B.F. Perkins is a self-taught artist who was kind of a merchant marine, and he traveled around the world. I think he was in 24 countries in the 48 years that he was gone from his home of Alabama. And then when he returned, he started preaching. He had found God. He was an evangelical preacher. He had found God somewhere in Europe during his travels, been saved in the evangelical tradition, and came home to Alabama, built a church, and started making art. And preaching and making art were his, that was his life for the rest of his life. He created an environment around the church in his yard that was one of the great self-taught, art environments in America. Unfortunately, after his death, it was kind of picked apart, and the whole structure eventually burned. But that environment was a lot like Howard Finster's. It was just maximalist. Everything was painted. The walls, the rocks, and all of the little sculptures. He had Christ open tomb that he had built at the front of a property. And everything was in very patriotic colors. So a lot of his work were biblical references and references to the art and architecture of biblical times, but also very patriotic work. So a lot of Statue of Liberties and American flags, and everything was red, white, and blue as far as the eye could see. It was a really fascinating place. And he used these private languages over and over again. And one of the most confusing, I don't understand where he got this idea and what exactly it means. And I've researched, and I can't really figure out what these birds mean to him, except that they're peacocks probably. And he calls them Cherokee Lovebirds. And this is, I've been looking for, we've had a B.F. Perkins calendar in the collection for a while, and I've been looking for the right Cherokee Lovebird for a long time. And Kevin Cole, a new donor from who's living in the Mississippi Gulf Coast now, gave us several pieces, including this wonderful Cherokee Lovebirds. The next piece is one of the most exciting pieces to come into the collection since I've been at the museum. This is Charles Delshaw. And Delshaw was one of the earliest known visionary artists in America. From about he only created work from about 1988 to about, was it
1880
till about 1922 was when the last works, and most of them were created right at the turn of the century through 22. And he was Prussian born. He got not much is known about his personal life or his biography, except that he was a butcher. He got his citizenship in rural Texas and ended up living with his daughter in Houston. And that's where he made his work, was after he was retired. He was living in this home in Houston with his daughter and her husband. And he had an attic space that he would work at, his office space. He would drink coffee and read the paper. And a lot of those earlier works, especially, will have what he called press blooms about the aviation. So advances in aviation or disasters in aviation, he would cut those out and include them in these drawings. And he created this imaginary world where there was this special gas that this group of scientists were trying to build airships around, this lifting gas, this floating gas that they would use inside the airships. Now, there are some conspiracy theorists that believe that all of this is true and that there's a government cover-up of this special gas that can help people fly. But there's no proof to back any of that up. And as far as we know, this all existed in his imagination. So this piece is around 1920. There was only, I think there were 12 notebooks that he filled with these drawings and collages. And after he died, they just stayed in the attic from the late 20s until the late 60s. And in the 60s, there was a fire in the house, a small fire and some water damage. And all 12 of those big notebooks, maybe 13, some say 13, I'm not sure, but 12 or 13 scrapbooks filled with these drawings and collages were set out on the sidewalk as trash. A local antiques dealer was walking by and saw them and gave the trash pickup guy who was about to collect them $100 for all 12 of them, and took them back to his antique store where they lived for another year under a pile of rotting rugs. And a young student at St. Thomas there in Houston was familiar with these pieces from the antique store and talked him into letting her put them in an exhibition about the history of flight. And she also showed them to the great collector Dominique de Menil, patron of the arts, who started the Menil collection in Houston. And Dominique bought 4 of them immediately, 4 of the whole sketchbooks immediately. And I think she paid about $1,200 a piece for them, and this was in the late 60s, early 70s, I believe. And then with the building on that success, he sold notebooks to the Witt Museum and the San Antonio Museum there in Texas. And then the rest of them went to collectors, private collectors. I know a lot of these collectors, or several of them, and several of them are on the board of these museums, either the San Antonio Museum or the Menil collection. And so they just kind of got bought up, and not many of them hit the secondary market anymore. Some of them were dismantled and individual pieces sold, and that's what circulates. So I didn't have a whole lot of hope that we were going to get one of these great Delshaws from around 1920. And then I found this piece in a collection, and the donor was the collection of Michael Burke, and the donor was very generous, and we were able to get this Delshaw into the collection. So one of the great acquisitions for the museum in the past 5 years, for sure. Sorry for the bad image on this. This is a Thornton dial. And I'm pretty sure if you're familiar with the Ogden, you're very familiar with the work of Thornton Dial, one of the great artists from Bessemer, Alabama, a black steelworking town. And he's mainly known for his large mixed media paintings and constructions and sculptures. There was major exhibitions all around the United States, and he's known around the world. Probably while he was alive, people considered him the greatest living self-taught artist. I believe Lonnie Holley probably holds that title now. But we did not have, although we have 2 major paintings in the collection, what we did not have was a really good drawing. And this is a really good drawing and a very unique drawing. Most of his drawings hold faces and animals, and this one does not. It's just buildings. It's a city. And it's called, I have to move myself to be able to see it. Well, I think it's called A Lot of Work in Town. But ooh, I'm going crazy here. Okay.
No, back.
Back. Yeah, so that's called A Lot of Work in Town, mixed media on paper, and is a gift of Michael Baer, who gave us several really great works at once. And the next one is actually my favorite of his gifts. And this is Ronald Lockett. Now, Ronald Lockett was, I can't remember if he was a nephew or a cousin, but he was a younger relative of Thornton Dial that lived there in Pipetown in Bessemer, which is a really tough neighborhood of steel workers, Black neighborhood of steel workers. And Ronald was not really fit for that community because he was very small, really short guy, kind of, delicate sensibilities. He graduated high school, but never pursued any kind of career. Identified as an artist very young and was calling himself an artist by the time he was 20. And he didn't, by all accounts, he didn't really do anything but create art. And so most of the community just didn't pay much attention to him at all because he didn't have your typical aspirations of someone in that community. And he was, kind of effeminate and slight and had a tough life. Now, most of his works depict, of his figurative works, he does have some abstracted works, but most of his figurative works are self-portraits. They're very green and verdant, and they're in the forest, and they're of a deer that's been caught trapped in a fence. And that's because I think he felt like he was trapped in his situation. And he was representing himself as that deer who was a victim of his circumstances and trapped in this situation, wrapped up in barbed wire fence. But there were a few paintings that were like this. The deer is not trapped. The deer is standing tall. But it's a night scene. It's a nighttime scene. It's in the darkness. Well, Ronald's brother was one of the first soldiers that went missing in action in Iraq. His two brothers, one of them went in the military, one of them went into law enforcement, three brothers, and the third one went into a life of crime in the prison system. But this is the oldest brother that was a military man and everyone looked up to, and he was missing in action. Later, he was killed in action, they find out, but prisoner of war. Actually, he was a prisoner of war, not killed in action, he was a prisoner of war. But when this was painted, he was just missing in action. So this is not a portrait of Ronald Lockett himself, but a portrait of his brother, who is not trapped in a bad situation. He's standing proud, but he's lost in the night. So like I said, I only know of 3 of these paintings, and I was shocked when I saw that this guy wanted to give this to the Ogden. So very, very exciting acquisition.
Mixed media.
It is. It's, well, a little about it. You see this, a lot of his paints were discarded paints from Thornton Dial's back shed. They were thrown in the back of the property. And Ronald would go back and get these very oxidized paints. And so they were, house paints, car paints, and ruined oxidized paints, give them this very unique surface. But then you can't really see it in this image, but the deer itself, inside of those white lines that outline the deer, is actually piled up chicken wire to give it real texture. And you'll have to come to the museum to see that element of it. I'm sorry we don't have a better picture of it here. This is a really good image. This is
Original.
He was an artist who was born and raised in New Orleans. Really got his start at House of Blues, where he took some art classes. He was mentally handicapped and took some classes through a program that the House of Blues had. And really everybody, he really loved it, and everybody really encouraged the work because he was so good. This is probably the best Reggie Mitchell I've seen. We have 2 of the best Reggie Mitchells now in our collection. But after the House of Blues classes and the program that they studied in the House of Blues, he went on to show some work at Andy Antipas's gallery, Barristers, when it was on Royal Street. And there he got to meet other Black vernacular artists from New Orleans. And Andy would kind of open up his courtyard of that space and give space for the artists to work, give them art supplies, just create an environment where they could be productive. And Reggie was part of that scene, along with Roy Ferdinand, Herbert Singleton, Wellman Charlehorn. So he was very much a part of that. But after Hurricane Katrina, he kind of disappeared. And I believe he went with some family to Texas. They didn't trust the art world. They didn't like the art world. And they didn't let him engage anyone. After Hurricane Katrina, he was really just kind of lost in Texas there. And then recently I heard that he had passed away, unbeknownst to anyone in the art world. We have 2 pieces now in the Ogden's collection, and more you'll see the work coming up in the secondary market. He is being recognized as a major figure in New Orleans vernacular art.
Looks like Mardi Gras.
Well, it's Moses is what it's.
I know.
So this one, sorry, I let it be too big, so you'll never be able to. You can move your own little screen around if you want. But this is we have 2 major Purvis Youngs on display at the Ogden right now. Both of them are gifts of Alice Yellen and Kurt Gitter. I chose to show this one for our presentation. This is the most recent one and the most unique one. Now, I'm trying to figure out who this might be. I think it's a football team. There's 11 players. They all have numbers on, but some people say, well, that doesn't look like football uniforms. So I'm not sure. And it's not really helmets, because that's how he depicted these figures, and the kind of saint-like black figures with halos behind them sometimes. But Purvis, I could talk for an hour about Purvis's narrative, but he was basically a homeless person who claimed some space under a bridge area in Overtown in Miami, as his own, and created an environment, a long wall of paintings that he would paint on discarded wood. And he was self-educated, but he was highly familiar with the history of Western art, and loved Michelangelo, loved Goya, and was a student of history. And so a lot of his works are historical, but he was also depict the world around him. He would deal with drug problems in Miami. He would depict the Haitian boat people when that was a major subject of conversation in Miami and social issue that they were addressing. So, it was not only dealing with major themes in Western art history and Western history, but also, depicting the crisis of the world right around him. By all accounts now, people are really looking at him as influential in neo-expressionism, social expressionism, and street art. So every passing year, he becomes more important to the American art narrative, and more valuable as a result. And we're so lucky to have these really 2 masterpieces. We have about 8 pieces in the collection, and they're all great, but these 2 that were recent gifts are huge. And they're both masterpieces. So excited about that. If you can't see that, you can you can click on and move your little screen over. I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking about that when I made this PowerPoint. Clementine Hunter's African Head. Now, I think all of you who are familiar with the Ogden know that we have probably the best collection of Clementine Hunter of any public institution. And we have work from every period of her career, whether it's the earliest paintings, the earliest works on paper. We have a few later works. We've got her small depictions of individual community members. We even have 2 of her abstracted pieces. But one thing we were missing is the African Head, which was a small series of these portraits in profile, with different African cloth on their heads and headdresses, and then a flower or a bouquet on their shoulder, on their chest. And Roger Ogden's been looking for the right one for years, and we never could find the right one for the collection. And I've been looking also, knowing that Roger would buy it if I found the right one at auction. And again, Michael Burke, newly retired, moved full-time to his New Orleans home and wanted to support the Ogden with some donation of art. And I went to look at the Del Shaw, and then he had the perfect African head hanging in his bathroom downstairs. So I said, Michael, that African head is amazing. And he said, well, I'd love to give it to the museum. So we're finally filled that missing part of our Clementine Hunter collection. Now, this artist is someone that you probably have not heard of, Helen Burkhart Mayfield. And Helen Burkhart Mayfield was from Texas, ended up in Austin. I believe she was she was from Bastrop, maybe. Or no, she wasn't from Bastrop, but her husband moved her out there. But she was an artist. She was trained as a dancer, and her husband was a visual artist. And they had moved up to New York City, and she was very involved in kind of the street performance scene of New York in the 60s, taking over the streets with these big performances and deeply involved in fine art. And then they moved to Austin, and she opened an art market there, and started working with the mentally handicapped in arts educations and art therapy, and did a lot of great work in that way. And then she started showing signs of her own mental illness. And it started getting worse, and her husband tried to move her out to the country, to Bastrop. She wasn't having it. She would have nothing to do with living out there in the country. And so she left her husband and moved back to Austin, and eventually ended up kind of on the streets. And she would make these grand costumes out of rags and refuse and huge headdresses, and would go out on the streets and stop traffic. And the police didn't know her history or what she was doing. What she was trying to do was relive those years in New York City when she was a performance artist. But they just thought she was a crazy lady stopping traffic in Austin. So she spent much of the last part of her life sitting in jail, and then they would release her, and she was just the local crazy lady. And she made these beautiful drawings, and she also did collage work. But the drawings were these visions, and they're all very dark and very kind of disturbing. These kind of nightmare visions that she was having in her mind. And then she would sell those to the local antique store owners and art gallery owners and people that appreciated who she was and wanted to help her out. So there's not a whole lot of them that come up to auction. Martina Baton was a major collector and dealer of vernacular art in New York City, who's been very generous with several pieces. Before her death this year, she just passed away, sadly. But this was a piece that she had in the collection, and she was thrilled to know that I was a fan of Miss Burkhart Mayfield's work, and so she knew that the Ogden was the right place for it. We got 2 of these, as well as a major Roy Ferdinand collection and a couple of other pieces as well. This is from a different donor.
Ruthie the Duck Lady.
This is Ruthie the Duck Lady by Roy Ferdinand. Total transparency, Ruthie was a dear friend of mine and used to come hang outside my door in the French Quarter and tell everybody to go get that boy for me when I was in my 20s, where I had to buy her drinks and take her around and go get Vienna sausages for the duck. But, major kind of French Quarter character figure in New Orleans history and culture, depicted by Roy Ferdinand, known as the Goya of the Ghetto, one of the great vernacular artists to come out of the city of New Orleans, who depicted a lot of violence that happened in Central City in the 90s, police brutality, murders, crime, drug abuse, all of the scourges of his community at a time when Central City was one of the most violent places in America, if not the world, during that kind of age of crack cocaine. But he also did some beautiful, just kind of simple portraits of characters from the French Quarter in New Orleans, of other artists, and of just neighborhood people. And those are really my favorites. They're not the ones that get published as much, but those are my favorites. And so this is a perfect example of one of those, someone he would have known in the French Quarter, just from being a New Orleanian and also from hanging out in Andy Antipas's gallery on Royal Street. He would have seen her quite often. Next year in the fall, we haven't announced it yet, but I'll be doing a major exhibition of Roy Ferdinand's work, spanning his entire production, all of the themes of his work. And we'll have a guest curator, which everyone will be very surprised with, working on that and the publication. So we've gotten 13 other Roy Ferdinands recently into the collection, but I'm only showed one in this exhibition because I'm holding those back for Roy's big show. So these are artists that, well, the late great Eric Burkhart labeled a movement in New Orleans called visionary imagists. These were artists that were inspired by the Chicago Imagists, the Harry Hu, the Monster Roster, etc. And they were creating work in that tradition in New Orleans beginning in the 1980s. Artists like Robert Gordy and Douglas Bourgeois and Jessica Goldfinch and Jacqueline Bishop. But kind of the godfather of that scene was a man named George Febres, who lived in New Orleans. He was I don't have it in my notes. I believe he was from Ecuador, maybe. But he had immigrated here a long time ago, and he was kind of the person who was the gel that held that community together, this group of artists together. He had a gallery space that he showed this work in, and he created great work himself. Most of his prints are in the Historic New Orleans collection. We have two works now of George Febres in the collection, both gifts of Paul Lehman. And this is from a series of portraits of art patrons that he did in 1987. He had a show of them, and I know of one other I've seen. He did a portrait of Sidney Bestoff, but this is the great Sonny Norman, who was his main patron as an artist. And this is called The Sunny Also Rises, obviously a reference to Hemingway's novel. And then here is another piece of his called The Handbag. And it's just a cloth soft sculpture in the tradition of Klaus Oldenburg. It's a hand, and it's a handbag. Another member of that group was Alan Gerson, and Gerson continues, much like Jackie Bishop and Douglas Bourgeois, continues to make great work. This piece, Encounter 3 Nest, won a competition for bus stop art. I guess they created one of the streetcar stops on Canal Street, I believe, was decorated with a screen made from this image. And then shortly thereafter, he donated it to the Ogden. But with this series, he was imagining a world where, like another planet, where humans never evolved as a dominant race, where it's still dinosaurs living in this kind of jungle environment. And so it's totally imaginary, visionary depiction of some of those tiny little dinosaurs in this imaginary world. Ed Smith, I see as not a person who is a continuation of that tradition. I don't believe, he was definitely not involved with the original core group, but I like to look at that movement as something that is ongoing, to carry on Burkhart's idea of visionary imagist, being a group of artists working in that style in South Louisiana. And people like Justin Forbes would be part of that, as well as Ed Smith, who was an educator at LSU, who's recently retired, and just had a wonderful show at Spillman Blackwell, right down the street from the Ogden in their new space. But all of his work depicts these birds mainly, and animals and flora, who are pushed into these little islands. There's smaller and smaller spaces. So it's about habitat destruction. It's very, very beautiful painting in these confectionery colors of a very, very dark subject that we're facing. And this is just a group of what I consider New Orleans icons. Sorry for the bad picture with reflection, but we got a beautiful, this wonderful large scale drawing, Conte crayon on craft paper of Enrique Alferez. Not included in the exhibition, which is also one of the major acquisitions of the Ogden's history, is our recent acquisition of his bronze sculpture, La Vietnamita, Mother and Child, which you'll see in the atrium of the museum now. But this was a piece that Roger had gifted us a few, well, I guess 6 years ago now. And it was the first drawing we've had in our collection. I did a major exhibition of Enrique Alferez back in 2012, which was kind of the beginning of a resurgence of interest in his work in New Orleans that led eventually to the Hellis Foundation purchasing a major collection. I like to think that started when I went to the Hellis Foundation and asked them to buy a major piece for the Ogden, and they were like, well, we're just going to buy it all and put it on, create a sculpture park, which is wonderful. And if you haven't been to the Enrique Alferez Sculpture Garden at City Park, you're missing out. It's one of the treasures of New Orleans. But this fulfills that need for a work on paper. Now, a little about Enrique and his drawings is he did not create preparatory drawings for his sculptures. He created with his hands. He created the sculptures in 3D with his hands. And then after they were finished, he would go back and make drawings. I've known a few sculptors that work in that way. Willie Birch, Anita Hill. We had one major piece of Willie Birch's early paper mache work from about the same time in the collection called Going Home. It's been one of the cornerstone pieces of our collection that we've shown many, many, many times. This one's a lot tougher to deal with. But this was also a piece he made while he was in New York City, in his brief time in New York City. In 1990, he was living in New York, maintaining a studio, and believe it or not, Arthur Roger had a gallery in New York, a second gallery in New York. And this piece, along with another one that I didn't put on the slideshow, a smaller piece called Working Girls, were both in an exhibition at Arthur Roger Gallery in 1990. Connie Boucher, who was a collector from California, was in town, saw the show, fell in love with the work, and bought two major pieces, did a studio visit with Willie, and these works kind of disappeared into a private collection in an apartment in Los Angeles. Now, Connie was part owner of the Peanuts copyright. So this is Snoopy money that funded her collection, Snoopy and Charlie Brown. But when she passed away and her son, Michael Boucher, was looking to place some of her collection pieces into museums, Arthur Rogers suggested the Ogden for this Anita Hill piece. Now, Willie Birch was working in his studio, and if you've ever met Willie, you know he has strong political opinions, and he's not afraid to share them. It's one of the things I love about the man. But he's watching, I can just imagine Willie watching the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings on television and just the things he would be saying. Instead of just saying it out loud, which I'm sure he did, he created this piece in the studio while watching the confirmation hearings. And there's a lot of quotes, both visual quotes, visual references, and literate and actual transcript quotes on this piece. And I would encourage you to come spend some time with it. I'm not going to go into all the imagery. It can get pretty tough, but I'd be happy to show you if you come to the museum. Sorry again for not wonderful images, because these are both fabulous paintings. George Durow is an artist much like Benny Andrews and several other kind of cornerstone, backbone artists in our collection. George is someone who we would like to have an encyclopedic collection of, and who we have some masterpieces by. And I think these two pieces are masterpieces. And this piece in particular is rare because George's main subject matter was the human body and the human form, but mostly male. And it's rare to find such a powerful depiction of a female form in his work. So these were commissioned by the Cellini family. Sue Ann and Dando Cellini, and they hung in their living room, I believe. And so they had commissioned a pendant pair, male and female. I encourage you again to come see them in person, because I'm sorry, I thought these pictures were better than they are, but they're masterpieces. They're really true masterpieces by George Giroux, 1988 oil and canvas. And the great Urzy Schwartz, another New Orleans icon. Urzy was actually the niece of the Dean of Modernism in the South, Paul Ninas. And she grew up in the French Quarter. Her grandmother had that grand Georgian home on the 700 block of Esplanade with the big lawn and the brick fence. And so she kind of grew up in that last frontier of Bohemia in the French Quarter. She left and she taught at Cooper Union sculpture for over 20 years, and then returned home to New Orleans at the end of her grandmother's life, and lived on in that home on Esplanade for most of the rest of her time here in New Orleans. I consider her one of the great surrealists in the American South, and one who's got a uniquely New Orleans sensibility. But this piece has not been seen probably since the early 90s. It was in a crate. She gifted her entire estate of her own work to the Ogden at her death, with the exception of the bed. Her bed, which I told her was too big for the Ogden to take into the collection before she passed away. So she gave the bed to the New Orleans Museum of Art, along with one other sculpture to sweeten the pot for them. But we received everything else in her collection. She was also, again, transparency, she was a drinking buddy of mine in the French Quarter. And I did her only major museum show at the Ogden. But this piece is typical of her hilarious surrealist sensibilities. So this is a beautiful, her cabinetry skills were amazing. And so this is a wooden cabinet that she handmade and then covered in brass. And then there's a cast sow's ear, cast pig ear in bronze with just an old telephone cord attaching it. And it's called Telephone. And it's very, very, very Urzy Schwartz piece. There's 3 other works in the Built exhibition from her Saints series, which are a little tougher, but this one I just thought was amazing. Another surprise for me, beautiful piece by George Schmidt, The Battle of New Orleans, 2006. And this was a piece that was commissioned by Bryce Reveley and Alan Caspi for their home in, now I'm blanking on the name, I think it's called, it's not Rebellion. They owned a plantation home on the River Road, and they're both classical musicians and had kind of a conservatory going there. And this piece was commissioned for that space, but it is just a masterpiece. It's huge. It's about 13 and a half feet long, actually. And if anyone knows George Schmidt, he's as much a historian as he is an artist. So everything in this would be historically accurate. And I've stood in front of it with people who know the Battle of New Orleans inside and out, and they're calling names left and right and describing the scene. So I think we need to get one of those historians to actually write something on this piece. It is a brand new acquisition. It just came into the collection. It's the first time it's being shown in public. So we still have a lot of work and research and writing to do this piece justice. And then some contemporary art pieces. Susan Jamison's Lovelace was a piece that was recently shown in the 2020 exhibition Entwined, which was a gorgeous exhibition that opened a week after we shut down. My crew and I stayed on after we weren't allowing people in the building anymore. We stayed on just to get it finished, hoping that it wouldn't be long before we could open it up. But it was an exhibition that not enough people saw, a really beautiful exhibition. And one of the artists was Susan Jamison. This was a piece in that collection, in that gallery of her work. It's rather large. It's about 6 feet tall. It's a life-size self-portrait. And then but it's done in egg tempera. What makes this thing so fascinating and so masterful is the medium, really. Egg tempera is extremely difficult to work with. It's a very ancient medium that's usually used in early religious paintings, and so it brings that kind of religious feeling to it when you work with it. It's the medium itself is, you know, egg. The yellow of an egg is the binder, and so you're beginning the process with the very alchemy of life there. But there's no room for a mistake with egg tempera. It dries immediately once it hits the surface. You cannot blend on the surface. So any shading you see there are just hair-like brush marks to get shading in the work. So from a technical perspective, it's masterful. And then of course the imagery is so beautiful as well. Another piece from the Entwined exhibition that came to the Ogden, this time a gift of the artist, Meyer and Kristen. Please go online to that exhibition's page, and bios for both of these artists are extensive. I had a lot of time to write because we were locked down. So there's some beautiful bios about her process and her imagery, but this was a piece that was a signature image for the exhibition. And she's an artist who lives and works here in New Orleans. She also has a home in Brookhaven, Mississippi, where she's been since, where she was most of the COVID lockdown. She has a place in Miami that she's maintained for 30 years, and where she is right now because her mother's not well. But she's a Calabrian American artist from the South Side of Chicago. Who maintains studios in Miami, New Orleans, and Brookhaven, Mississippi. But she's a sculptor who works with found objects, she basically builds these things in space with no plan whatsoever, improvising this process of binding objects together. And she works with no skeletal structure. You know, there's no skeleton to this piece. She's literally taking objects and binding them together, and she can make them 6 feet tall and they stand perfectly straight and don't wobble. And it's just an amazing thing to watch. But there's a lot of narrative that goes into her very process of collecting materials, binding them up in these containers or bags that she then ties up, where she lets the energies fuse with one another over time, and then unwraps them and makes these figures, these characters and she's letting the energy of those objects guide her. So very, very spiritual practice, and it's a really powerful piece. And Horton Humble, who is an artist who you also see behind me here. But he's an artist from the Treme, from New Orleans. He's about my age, so middle-aged artist from Treme. He left New Orleans and studied poetry at Columbia University in Chicago, and was rather critically acclaimed avant-garde experimental poet. But he learned pretty quickly that no one was going to pay him to be an experimental poet. And he was also making visual work. And so he really started focusing on his visual work. And that's where his focus was when Hurricane Katrina hit. He came to New Orleans in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina to see the damage to his city and community, and created a body of work on the detritus of the streets, the trash, the destruction from the destruction of Katrina, called Debris, and he got his first exhibition with that. That's where this piece is from. And then he started. He's a world traveler. He never stops, and a lot of his work is on unstretched canvas, so they can roll it up in tubes and go wherever he wants to in the world. He's traveled all over Africa and Asia, Central and South America. But his favorite place is either Dominica or Portugal. And Portugal, in Lisbon, they really love him. And he's had at least 3 residencies funded in Lisbon through the Arts Council of Lisbon there. and its created bodies of work. This piece was after Katrina, Prospect came in, kind of changed the visual landscape, the arts landscape of New Orleans, and turned New Orleans into an arts destination and a place where artists had opportunity, which is something that they never had in his life before. And so he'd been around the world, he'd been in Lisbon for a while, and he came back and he saw New Orleans with new eyes. You know, his perception of his city changed because his city had changed. And whereas before he thought, man, I love my city, but there's no opportunity for me there. All of a sudden there was opportunity in a post-Katrina world. So this piece is really about that, the way people see their cities and their communities, and it's called Scattered Sight. And it was a piece that he gave to the Ogden's auction, and Roger Ogden purchased it at the auction with the intention of it never leaving the Ogden. So it's our first piece by Horton Humble in the permanent collection. Hopefully we'll get more. And I believe this might be the final piece. How am I doing on time? Oh, perfecto. This is Mel Chin's Safe House Door, another gift from Martina Baton. This is a small work on paper, but if you look closely, it's a collage made from the inside out security envelopes, like envelopes that banks would use to send a check in with that hash marking inside, printed inside to keep you from being able to see information through the envelope. And it's a safe house door. So this is a piece that was made either leading up to or in conjunction with his piece in Prospect 1 called The Safe House. And the Safe House was a project that Mel Chin, who is Chinese descent from Houston and one of the great artists ever to come out of the state of Texas, well revered now as a contemporary artist. But he was in New Orleans, and he started a project called the Fundred Project to bring attention to lead in the soil in New Orleans and how it affects New Orleans children. And so the Fundred Project had communities all over America creating their own, children would create their own $100 bills. And then he had a armored truck that was fueled on vegetable oil that would go to these different communities and collect these fundreds, these fake hundreds, to bring, and at one point they brought them all to the safe, which was the Safe House in New Orleans, which the Safe House, he built a huge safe door on a house in the lower Ninth Ward in post-Katrina. Now there was some controversy around the person that organized that and the promises they made to Mel Chin about fixing the houses after the project was over, which didn't happen. It was a lot. It almost ruined Mel Chin's reputation with what happened after this project was over. But it was a very important project at the time, and the Fundred Project is still ongoing with the idea that they're raising money for remediation for lead removal in especially the schoolyards of New Orleans. So I was very happy to see this piece come into the collection, another beautiful piece from Martina Baton. And that's it. If you want to unmute everybody, I'm open for questions.
Hey, Bradley, this is Karen Louise Crane.
Hey.
Hey, how are you? I miss seeing you around. I was just wondering, excuse me, do people come to you and say, hey, I've got a collection that you might be interested in some pieces, or do what's the process on your end about finding new works for yours?
A lot of different ways.
For the Ogden.
A lot of different ways that happens. Sometimes it's a cold call, an email to General Curatorial, and then it'll go through the process of being discussed in curatorial meetings among the curatorial team. Any submission to the accessions committee needs the what we call an justification that's written by a curator. And most of the time, if you're going to take the time to write a justification, you're saying that, yes, well, I believe this piece should come into the collection. Sometimes it's just, you've got a really great donor. Maybe you don't agree with it, that it should come into the collection. Maybe it's not right for the collection. Maybe we have better examples, or maybe it has some serious conservation issues that we'll face in the near future. But we'll still bring it to the acquisitions committee. The acquisitions committee will view those things and make a suggestion to the board of trustees. But every offer is voted on by the board. Unless if it just doesn't meet our mission, if everyone agrees that this just isn't worth taking to the acquisitions committee, then we don't bring it to the acquisitions committee. If it's a piece of Japanese art from the 16th century, we'd love to have it, but it doesn't meet our mission. You know, it's not in, of, or about the American South. So it doesn't come up there. But, you know, sometimes it's estate planning that are looking for people who might already collect that artist. Sometimes it's me spotting something in someone's bathroom and going, oh my God, I've been looking for that for the Ogden. or, you know, it could be Michelle Pontiff. It's like, oh my God, I saw this beautiful Benny Andrews. You know, you should take, they say they want to sell it. Well, you think they might want to give it? So it comes from many different ways. Unfortunately, we're such a young institution and we don't have an endowment yet, that we have no acquisitions budget. So there's no money for me to go out and purchase things for the museum's collections that are missing. So like there are some big holes in our collection that I'm trying to fill. And I have some lists if any of y'all are interested in seeing. The one that's most complete is Black artists that are missing from the collection. So artists that are divided into living and dead. And I'm working on other lists, you know, but one of the holes we have in our collections that's just glaring is Black female artists, you know, that are not vernacular, contemporary, fine artists, you know. We have lots of academic Black artists, but they're all male. Almost every single one of them is male. So this is something that we've identified in ourselves, you know, we know they exist. They're from the South and they exist. The work is out there. Collectors have not brought them to us. If we had an acquisitions budget, we could fix that immediately. But since we rely on the generosity of artists and their donor and their collectors, this is something that I just have to constantly say that we're looking for to fill that need for us to better tell the story of the South to the public. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can think of a half dozen right off the top of my head that I bet you'd really, you know, I already identified, you know, Mapo, Katrina Andre, Ashley Teamer, you know, all of these folks.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that's very good to know.
All three folks that we've shown at the museum.
Yes, exactly.
As well. So,
exactly.
And also people like Renee Stout, you know, from DC. So there's a lot of artists out there. There's plenty to choose from.
Right.
So
right. Well,
y'all
cool.
y'all get to work.
Right. Exactly. We'll keep an eye out for you.
Any other questions?
Ed Smith, going back to Ed's, this is Nancy. Is he from Florida?
I believe he's from, you know, I don't know where he's born. That's a good question. But he taught at LSU.
Okay.
Until he retired.
We have some other of his things, don't we?
That's the only piece.
That's it, huh?
That's the only piece. And that piece was in Louisiana Contemporary. And it was a gorgeous piece. Everybody fell in love with it.
I remember seeing it. And I remember this big blue, I think it was birds, and it was a big painting, and it was about the birds and the animals running out of the landscape.
Mark Messersmith.
Yes. That's what it reminded me of.
From Tallahassee, who is on view right. That piece is up again. and it's in the built exhibition because of all the sculptural elements on the piece. It's in that sculptural art exhibition.
Okay, great.
So,
Thanks.
mhm.
That's just-
Larry, you're muted.
Let me try it again.
Yeah,
Could you
you're-
say something about that gallery on Royal Street that was so important to some of the vernacular artists?
Yeah, Andy Antipis, who just closed the gallery this past year. He had moved it first from Royal Street to Aretha Castle Haley when that started to pop over there. And then he had moved it after that to his home, basically, the ground floor of his home on St. Claude Avenue. And when the St. Claude's Arts District started to really come into its own. And the thing, Andy's an interesting figure. I think he's one of the great scholars of Southern art. I think he's one of the great scholars of Black vernacular art. He's a huge figure in the New Orleans art scene, but he's also an ex-con that served time for rare document theft when he was a young man. So he doesn't get the credit he deserves, I think. And I'm not even sure he actually did what they said he did, but it ruined his career as a professor. But what he did afterwards was create space, first with a lot of ex-cons, prison artists. Wellman Shawhorn was in jail, 37, wrongfully convicted, served 37 years in Angola. But when he got his work out of Angola to Andy's gallery and had a show up in Andy's gallery while he was in jail. And at one point, the Rosenacks, who wrote the handbook for collecting vernacular or self-taught art, major American collectors, they walked into Andy's gallery and bought everything by Wellman Shawhorn and included him in the first Art Brut, self-taught show of American Art Brut that was in Lausanne, Switzerland. So he kind of made the canon, Andy would create these opportunities for these artists where they wouldn't have them elsewhere. And if you talk to anyone, whether it's Kristen Myers, who's in this show, or Dan Tague, or any of the young artists in town, they'll tell you that they could always show with Andy when other galleries wouldn't give them the opportunity. And so he's really been a force that's hasn't been recognized by the museums that much, or by other major patrons that much, but among the artists, among the reality on the artist is that he's created opportunity. And his writing is extensive on Roy Ferdinand, on Herbert Singleton, on all of these artists that he's shown. He really is one of the preeminent scholars of the work. So Barristers, was on Royal Street, so it was right in the heart of all the tourist area. When I was a teenager coming to New Orleans visiting, that was the weirdest place I'd ever seen in my life. I was fascinated. I would just, come to New Orleans just to go to Barrister's Gallery because I knew I would see, self-taught artists like Roy Ferdinand. I would see a human skull, so voodoo objects. It was so exciting as a young man. And now he's become a friend and supporter of what we do. And entwined, all of the Jeffrey Cook works that were on view in the Entwined exhibition were from Andy's collection. And he and Jeffrey Cook were very, very close, and he gave Jeffrey opportunity early on. So yeah, I could go on, but I think it's important to note that maybe we wouldn't even, because of the support and space that he gave them, maybe we wouldn't even we wouldn't know about artists like Herbert Singleton and Roy Ferdinand and Wellman Shawhorn if it weren't for Andy Antipis and Barrister's Gallery.
Cool.
Bradley, would you say something about why we separate vernacular self-taught artists from everybody else?
We don't always. right now in the Built exhibition, there's vernacular artists showing side by side with academic artists. And I love seeing the trend of people like Bill Traylor being placed in context with other modernists of his era in the Menil collection recently. So I do like seeing that, but there is also something to be said about people who have a tradition that exists outside of academic circles. So I use the term vernacular now, and I don't think there are very many artists that could really truly be safely classified as outsider. If they were in the past. When I first started at the museum, we had 3 terms that we used for that type of work. And we used them at the same time, all the time. So it was self-taught, outsider, and visionary art. So all the shows we had under David Houston and Rick Gruber were called, the self-taught, outsider, and visionary art collection, or something of that sort. And I think that was very forward-thinking use of the language at the time. But outsider means that you, as we defined it, meant that you existed outside of society in some way. You existed outside of society because you were geographically isolated, or you were incarcerated, or you were held in a mental institution. And the reality is that no one is isolated anymore in that way. Even if you're in prison, you have media that you're engaging. Even if you're in the most rural place in Alabama has the internet now. So I think outsider, and it also says that they're outside, saying someone is outside of society can be a very colonial viewpoint too. Like, what society are you talking about? So I really don't like the term outsider, and we just don't use it at the Ogden anymore. Self-taught, you can be self-taught, but you're studying out of academic books and you're working in an academic style. So it doesn't always cover everything, but vernacular, I believe, does. Just like, every region has its own vernacular language. It's not bad or good, but it's just not the perfect academic English language or perfect academics, Parisian French. It's a vernacular, and I believe that says a lot about people working in rural places in styles that are particular to their own community, whether it's Homa wood carving or the dot and line Black folk art tradition like George Andrews. But again, this is language that's changing constantly and evolving, and I'm constantly evolving and changing my language with this as well. But I do believe vernacular suits what we do best right now. And I am consciously, and have been for quite a while, trying to place the work that goes beyond those terms in context with the larger art dialogue. So I got into a huge argument with the great sculptor Nancy Keenholz the first night I met her about this. And she told me I was full of the S word. But I told her, I said that Thornton Dial was an innovator and a visual artist that could hold his own in any gallery along Robert Rauschenberg. And she said, "You're full of shit." And I held my ground, and we argued about it, and we became close friends after that. She was old guard art world, and the very idea that someone like Thornton Dial could hang next to Rauschenberg didn't strike her fancy at all. Whereas I totally disagreed. I believe that he, on his own in rural Alabama with no contact with the larger art world, created amazing work on par with Rauschenberg.
Thanks for that, Bradley. I wonder about that all the time. How we make these divisions that are really not clear cut, but are a little muted, shall we say. Yeah.
And, you know, the influence of what at the time people called primitive artists on the modernists is becoming more and more clear every day, you know.
Right.
So, you know, when academic traditions is influenced by vernacular art, then aren't they the precedent? Aren't they the masters? So.
Yeah, we just finished talking about the Benin bronzes and the African sculptures, and that's not outsider art. I don't know what is, and yet that's a major influence on modern art.
Generations and generations of artists.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And then we have artists like Reverend McKendry Robbins Long, who is always included in those galleries, who was highly trained and lived in Whistler's apartment in London. But it was because he threw all of that away and started working in a style that was the antithesis of what was happening in academic art, you know, religious paintings with these religious visions and these really crazy colors. And so even though he's about as academic as you can get for a man of his generation, he's put in those same galleries with Howard Finster, you know.
Interesting.
I don't know if I went to jamming on Julia the other night. Did you go?
Well, I did not.
Well, they had, I want to say it was the Jonathan Ferreira. It's filled with Sean Major right now.
Arthur Roger.
It's Arthur. Okay.
Beautiful bricolage sculptures. Yeah, it's a gorgeous, gorgeous show.
Yeah,
I'm really, really happy for her.
Me too.
She left Callan and went straight to Arthur Roger. I was impressed that Arthur took a chance with her because I adore her work. Obviously, the Ogdens collected some major pieces over the years.
Yeah.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Brad.
Thank you.
I'm glad everybody came. All up to date.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
It was fun getting back to a tour of this nature, even though it was virtual.
I know, I can't wait to see y'all in the space next time. I'm back.
Hope next time it's in person.
Yeah, I hope that's soon. That it's beginning to look like stuff is easing. So
yeah, I look forward to it. I'm sure everyone's here is vaccinated, right?
Yeah.
Yay.
Yep.
Yes.
All right. So let's make a promise the next one will be in person then.
All right. At my house.
That's what I'm thinking about for September. So
Great.
Good show. That's great.
Great. Yeah.
Good to see everyone.
Thanks so much, Bradley.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I got
thanks, Bradley. That was great.
Another one in 15 minutes.
Let's give yourself a break.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Sarah.